First, we will discuss about the social structure of the Philippines under Spain. Social ranking was created in the society, and social structure is divided into three groups. First is the highest class. The people in this class are the Spaniards, Peninsulares, and the friars. Peninsulares are full-blooded Spaniards born in Spain. Second is the middle class. The people in this class are the natives, mestizos, and the creoles. Mestizos and creoles are those having a Spanish parent and a Filipino or Chinese parent. Third is the lowest class. The people in this class are the Filipinos. There are social tensions created between and among classes. A system of racial discrimination came to be institutionalized since high positions in the government were opened only to the pure-blooded Spaniards, and on the other hand, the members of the middle class as well as the Indios were considered inferior by the upper classes. In addition, Rizal belongs to middle class. His family is one of the distinguished families in Calamba since Rizal's family belonged to the Principalia, a town aristocracy in Spanish Philippines. And now let us proceed to the education. This is the timeline of the education during the 19th century. In year 1846, even in the smallest villages, the Indians find facilities to learn to read and write. For everywhere there are primary schools maintained by the pueblo. But those fortunate ones are the ones who were able to study to primary schools. The aptitude to learn of the Indio is remarkable. One sees them from their tenderest age tracing letters with a sharpened bamboo, sometimes on the sand or on green banana leaves. About 20 years later in the year 1863, the colonial government in Manila issued a decree on primary education. The first educational system for students in the country was established by virtue of the Educational Decree of 1863. It states that in one of the objectives of the Spanish colonial policy, which was to civilize the Filipinos, was largely frustrated because of the geography of the islands and the character and customs of the people. The decree sought to remedy the situation through establishing a teacher training school, since the foundation of all education was Christian faith firmly rooted in the hearts of men. The decree continued, and the school for teachers was entrusted under the supervision of the Jesuits. During this time, the Spanish schools started accepting Filipino students, and also during this time, the intellectual Filipinos emerged. In the year 1886, the decree was not completely successful because there are towns where it is impossible to maintain regular attendance at school. Its primary cause was because of the parents' laziness, the lack of teachers, the lack of supplies, the lack of school materials. In the year 1896, success of the educational work of Spain in the Philippines. The Filipinos learned to be self-determined people, and they learned to defend their native land. So in addition to the education system during this time, the teachers are Spanish missionaries. They also teach catechism to the natives. Education was religion-oriented. Christian doctrine prayers and sacred songs are taught. The Spanish curriculum consisted of 3 R's: reading, writing, and religion. And Spanish language is compulsory. There are also criticisms in their educational system. Overemphasis on religious matter. This is to promote Christianity through education. The missionaries emphasize the teachings of the Catholic religion. Another is poor classroom facilities. Another is absence of teaching materials. Schools were often poorly equipped, lacking desks, chairs, and writing materials. Another is shortage of teachers. Primary education was neglected. Prejudice against Filipinos in the schools of higher learning. Education during the Spanish regime was privileged only to Spanish students. The supposed Philippine education was only a means to remain in the Philippines as colonizers. Next is friar control over the system. The friars owned different schools from primary to tertiary levels of education. They controlled, managed, and supervised the educational system. So these are just some of the criticisms in their educational system. So in addition to the education system during this time, the teachers are Spanish missionaries. They also teach catechism to the natives. Education was religion oriented. Christian doctrine prayers and sacred songs are taught. The Spanish curriculum consisted of 3 R's: reading, writing, and religion. And Spanish language is compulsory. There are also criticisms in their educational system. Overemphasis on religious matter. This is to promote Christianity through education. The missionaries emphasize the teachings of the Catholic religion. Another is poor classroom facilities. Another is absence of teaching materials. Schools were often poorly equipped, lacking desks, chairs, and writing materials. Another is shortage of teachers. Primary education was neglected. Prejudice against Filipinos in the schools of higher learning. Education during the Spanish regime was privileged only to Spanish students. The supposed Philippine education was only a means to remain in the Philippines as colonizers. Next is friar control over the system. The friars owned different schools from primary to tertiary levels of education. They controlled, managed, and supervised the educational system. So these are just some of the criticisms in their educational system.
Good day, everyone. Good day, sir. To formally start with my discussion, here are the timeline overview of the different questions and respected time frames being possessed, consisting the history during the time of the rise of Chinese Mestizo. So the time frames are before 1741, during 1741 to 1850, and later in 1850 and 1898. So here are the possible questions to ponder and to be answered later in our discussion. So before 1741, here are the questions. So why are Chinese mestizos are not widely talked about on that time? Then the 4 categories of population, then the probable reason of the categorization, the rights during this time, and how are people being categorized, the rise of Chinese mestizos, and the creation of Binondo during or on 1594. So in 1741 to 1850, here are the 1810 statistics by Conem and the accounts on how great the economic position of the Chinese mestizos by Lanoy 1840, Sinibaldo Dimas 1842, and Zamora in 1840. Then later in 1850, 1898, it is the influential figures in the areas of industry, commerce, and business. Then the Pacto de Retro of what is the significance of Pacto de Retro is, and the significant role of Chinese mestizos, and the Rizal is a fifth generation of Chinese mestizos. So later we will know the answer of that different questions. The first takeaway questions we have is why mestizos are not widely talked about at that time. So it's because there is a confusion about the term mestizos, in which become apparent since 1898 due to the fact that there is no legally deprived mestizos class on that time. So for the sake of this discussion, let us define what mestizo is. So mestizo is defined as a man of mixed race, specifically one having Spanish and indigenous descent. So by this definition, being a breed between Spaniards bloodline and indigenous descent is highlighted. Like Wilberg, for instance, as he confirms this confusion of the Chinese mestizos in the Philippine history. So he said that there is a confusion of the subject matter and a description that is prominent in the study of history, as he claimed. So there are 3 mainly reasons as to why crisis of defining mestizos became prominent. So the first reason is the number of Chinese mestizos. Since there's a lot of Chinese fusion back then, so much so that 1810 statistics of common have mentioned for every 7,000 to 10,000 mestizos, there are 240,000 Chinese mestizos. So the next reason is the Chinese and Chinese mestizos are there even before the Spanish annual, as pre-colonial Filipinos have been trading with the Chinese. So the last reason is Chinese mestizos assume greater position in the society than the Spanish mestizos. So that are the three reasons why crisis in finding Chinese mestizos is prominent at the time. And now moving on to the next takeaway question, the categorization of population on that time, in which this categorization emphasis based on how much they should pay to the government as tribute. So mainly there are four categorization. First is the Spanish and the Spanish mestizo. So these people are collectively known as blancos because of their skin color, which is as wide as the blank canvas. So these people are not required to pay any tribute of the government. So these Spanish mestizos are not really or not required to pay any tribute to the government. Next is the Indios, or as Filipinos, pay a lowest or pinakadagamay nga tribute amount with amounting of 1.80 Philippine real. Next is the Chinese mestizos, which paid double than Indio, over 3 Philippine real, since Spaniards assume that this cluster of people have approximately double earning capacity. Then the fourth one is the Chinese, which paid the highest tribute. So they paid larger than what is Chinese mestizos, which amounting to 6 Philippine real amount. So now let's answer of why those categorization or kind of categorization occurred on the time. So there are possible probable reason of the categorization. So first is in Spanish thinking biology and economic had a certain correlation. Second is Spanish policy have been grounded more in economic and social reality, as well as lastly, the healthy society are in which people at different cultural backgrounds never left apart and allowed to live together in a healer-killer fashion. When we say healer-killer fashion means that without regard of order or without regard for order or something that is done in haste. So digging forward to the rights during the time frame before 1741, the prominent arrangement of the time is that Chinese is more restricted than both Indios and Mestizos. So this seems to the fact that everyone else in any or can join in any local government except for Chinese. And with all that being said, so how can people actually categorize, or how those people actually being divided? So, well, the population is simply categorized according to the status the status of the father. It means that if a father is an Indio, then their offspring is an Indio as well. If the father is Spaniards, then the offspring is Spaniards mestizos. Then if Chinese, then the offspring is Chinese mestizos also. And for the female individuals, they will be categorized according or based on the status of their husbands. However, it is a must to take note that its categorization is changeable for a fee. With this method is called dispensa de ley or gracias alcazar, which widely used in Spanish colonial America later in 18th century, and this is when also Rizal identity exerts itself. So the next takeaway questions to ponder is the rise of Chinese mestizos. So in these areas, Chinese mestizos are made possible because Spaniards considered Chinese mestizos are or as economically indispensable. Thus, intermarriage is encouraged by the Spaniards for Chinese to stay there in their areas or in their places, provided that with one conditions, which must be that both parties are converted or must be Catholic. So that's their that is their provided conditions to make the Chinese stay there or stay in their country. And due to the connection between the Spaniards and Chinese, This then leads to the creation of Binondo on 1594, or called as the Intramuros in Manila. So in 1594, the Spanish governor Luis Perez Desmareñas created Binondo as permanent settlement for Chinese mestizos who converted to Catholicism. And in this part of Manila, Chinese merchants and traders were free to do their business. So Binondo also became a place of intermarriages between Chinese immigrants and Filipino natives. So thus the emergence of the Filipino or the Chinese mestizos. So moving ahead to the history of the time frame 1741 to 1850 of the Chinese mestizo. So according to the 1810 statistics of Acroname, the data presented, it takes away the total Chinese of about 100,000 120,621 and represent about 5% of the total population from the standpoint of geographical distribution, which is the most obvious features of mestizos' numerical strength are in Tondo, Bulacan, and Pampanga. So to compensate, here are the accounts on how great the economic position of Chinese mestizos are. So despite the attempts of the Spaniards to treat them with disdain, it was the Chinese mestizos who had the biggest fortunes in the Philippines, as what Lanoy said in 1840. Sinibaldo 1842 also state that almost of the retail commerce is in their hands or is in the Chinese mestizo hands, and they may be counted as the middle class of the Philippines. And lastly, as Zamora 1840 also states or said that Chinese mestizos could completely replace the Chinese economically. So talking more about the history of Chinese mestizos, we are now in the time frame of 1850 to 1898. So that time Chinese became prominent and influential figures in the areas of industry, commerce, and business. So during the Spanish colonial period, so they carried on a lucrative trade by collecting goods from north and selling them to Manila and the nearby Philippines. So while the Spanish mestizos were concerned with foreign trade. So is it is it it is basically sharing of economic press in terms of exports and imports of products. So on the time, one of the famous industry was the indigo industry, which is in Malabon. So the process of the indigo that has taught by the Augustinian priest, which turns that they have a huge profit, and thus the introduction of Philippine products. And as Philippine lands began to use for commercial agriculture, the acquisition of such land became more competitive matter. So, as the classic instrument of land alienation has the Pacto de Retro, it also states that as early 1768, there were a law against the use of Pacto de Retro, so specifically against its use by the Chinese and the Chinese mestizos. So this Pacto de Retro means the contract of retrocession by which Indio landowners pawned his land with an option to repurchase it. But most of the Indios that time can't repurchase and even can't pay their loans, so their land became the Chinese territory. Moreover, the power of some mestizos was becoming such that when their interests were threatened by the government planning, so they involved the government in legal action, claiming that what the government proposed would harm the Indio, so whom they protect. And finally, the government representatives simply give in to the mestizos. And with the time goes by, the entrepreneurial power of Chinese mestizos grow in a way to the emergence of Philippines middle class, as described as more active and enterprising, more prudent and pioneering, more oriented to trade and commerce than the Indios, as Boring 1963 states. And the next takeaway question is, what is the significant role of Chinese mestizos in the society? So, as it was being states that it was once the formation of Filipino identity. And lastly, the Rizal is a fifth generation Chinese mestizo. So It was being then said that Rizal is a fifth generation Chinese mestizos. However, he and his father were considered as Indios. In some documents and scholarly papers even noted that Rizal disliked being called Chinese mestizos or Chinoy in modern sense, and dissociated himself from any Chinese relations. He also even depicted the bloody revolution and eventually led them to revolt, and at the same time, it is a sign of his contempt toward the immigrants in the Philippines as his novels brimmed with insult and scorn for the Chinese people. So, as Rizal clearly manifested also his anti-Christian feelings with his writings.
Let us now proceed to the reasons behind the rise of Chinese mestizos. So, first, the growing population of the Chinese, and second, the evolution of a large Chinese colony performing multiple services as traders, artisans, and domestic servants, which made them indispensable to the needs of the capital. Soon after the Spaniards founded the city of Manila in 1571, a large Chinese colony evolved, and they are those that were artisans, traders, and domestic servants. With this, they became indispensable or important to the economy. Soon after, their population continued to grow. However, the Spaniards could only see them as a potential threat, um, fearing that the Chinese would be far less loyal to them compared to the Indios, who are the Christianized natives, considering that the Chinese have different roots, which is from China. Right then, the Spaniards had to think of a way or a solution. They can't lose the Chinese because of their contribution to the economy. However, their growing population was just suspicious. So, they resolved this through a policy of converting the Chinese and encouraging marriage between Catholic Chinese and Catholic Indios. Their offsprings became the Chinese mestizos. The third is the Chinese mestizos were described as more active and enterprising, more prudent and pioneering, and more oriented to trade and commerce compared to the Indios. The Chinese mestizos inherited the economic dynamism of their Chinese ancestors. The expulsion of many Chinese in the late 1760s for their cooperation with the British, who occupied Manila in 1762 to 1764, paved way for the energetic and enterprising Chinese mestizos to penetrate the markets. In the absence of many Chinese traders, the Chinese mestizos shared economic power with the Chinese as exporters, importers, wholesalers, retail traders, and owners of majority of artisan shops. In fact, they practically took over from the Chinese as retailers in the provinces around Manila. And lastly, the Chinese mestizos in the Philippines possessed a unique combination of cultural characteristics, being descendants of two culturally different parents, one Chinese and one Indio, and with the influence of Spanish beliefs and the faith that they've put onto the people. It is of no doubt that the Chinese mestizos would have a rich and unique combination of cultural characteristics.
Now let's move on to the Inquilinos. Who are the Inquilinos? The Inquilinos is a person who held a near hereditary lease on agricultural land in the Spanish Philippines. The Inquilinos arise on 19th century during the time of Chinese mestizos. That is why most of the Inquilinos are Chinese mestizos. They are also um, a class of non-cultivating tenants or direct cash tenants. Inquilinos also a laborer indebted in a landlord who allows him to form a farm in parts of his property, usually in the marginal lands to keep away intruders, and who in exchange works without pay for the landlord. So, from that statement, it means that the inquilinos are those people who are working or renting on a land where they work under landlords, but they are not paid by them. Instead, they will give their earned money to them, which they get from um, their work or job. However, their payment depends on um, the quality or size of the land they are working or renting on. An example of inquilinos is Dr. Rizal because he came in this family background. Next, we have kasamahans or kasamas. They are the indigenous tenants, farmers, or the inquilinos generally hired sharecroppers, the kasamahans or kasamas to work on the land. Um, Kasamas are those people uh, who are I mean are those people of inquilinos or people of inquilinos. It includes the poor inquilinos who are the one who clean, take good care of the land, and also they are the house helper with them, with the inquilinos. Next, we have two classes of inquilinos, the big inquilinos and the small inquilinos. The first one, big inquilinos, employed overseers or katiwala. Their children studied at the best schools in Manila or abroad. This inquilinos has the capacity to lease two or more house lots and live themselves in the town center, while the small inquilinos often on the two big inquilinos. So these inquilinos are those people who pay fixed rents but lease smaller lots. They form their land by using their family health.
So now let's move on to the next topic, the hierarchy in the Inquilino system. So first, farmland in the Philippines is mostly owned by friars and secular Spanish. So these friars are the ones that are religious people, such as priests, and secular Spanish from the word secular meaning worldly, so they are non-religious. So next is the estate management was granted to an administrator who is a Spanish mestizo. So Spanish mestizo meaning they are of mixed race, and they deal with the appraisal, acquisition, development, marketing, or management of the properties. Next, the inquilinos paid a fixed rent, and the amount was determined by the size and quality of the land being worked on. So uh, these inquilinos are those that rents the property, and the size and quality of the land is being determined by the estate management, and they will pay the rent that they will give. And now lastly, with the expansion of land owned by missionary congregations, the proportions of the farmlands leased to inquilinos also increased. That is all. Thank you.
Now let's move on to the reasons behind the rise of the inquilinos. So at least in the modern Spanish, the term inquilinos has the same meaning as the English term tenant. So in the Philippines, the 19th century inquilino system is better understood as a qualified tenancy or the right to use land in exchange of rent. So consequently, many estates turned progressively to the inquilino system of land tenure. So before these Chinese mestizos are given the chance to acquire lands, they have to conform with the system which is ruled by the Spaniards. They need to convert themselves into Catholics and adopt a Christian name because this is one way to assimilate or absorb into the system. and it is needed so that the Spaniards will believe that these Chinese mestizos are not going to go against them in the future. Next is the rise of the Inquilinos paved way for the Chinese mestizos to dominate the rice training by being the supplier in Manila. The development of the export crop industry in the Philippines was motivated by the commercial undertakings of European and North American merchants who provided capital, organization, and access to foreign markets and sources of imports in the interior and buy up goods for export. This role was assumed primarily by the Chinese. Now, in the 18th century, Chinese already began to rise to their economic power. Then Philippines began to feel the impact of a commercial revolution based on the exports such as crops, sugar, and tobacco. It was the stimulus of this commercial activity that encouraged the monastic orders to leave lands to the Inquilinos. This is how the Inquilinos were able to acquire farmlands and lease from religious estates. Since before the Spaniards arrived in the Philippines, there are already Chinese people who are dominating the trading in the country because of economic purposes. So from the amassing of lands came to the haciendas. It was an outgrowth of the new system that emphasized the cultivation of cash crops. Next reason is we have their desire for economic expansion. As we all know, Chinese are really fan of business. The reason why most of them came to the Philippines because of economic opportunity. Since they find Philippines as a perfect place for trading because of its resources. And this is also the reason why colonizers really want to dominate our country. Lastly, they were able to acquire social status, facilitate assimilation, and participation as part of the non-Spanish allied society during the pre-Spanish time. There are three-tier native class structure. The small chiefly class, the slightly larger class of freemen, and mass of servile dependents following the Spanish conquest. There is the two-tiered class system. These two are the principal or the traditional political elite and the rest of the population. When this Inquilino system this arise, it constituted a provincial and or the a provincial social class, particularly in Cavite. They were termed as the middle class Caviteños during that time, and the status of a family is based on land ownership, financial wealth, education, and skin color. The Inquilinos, especially the big ones, were able to attain these things, and they are the most contributors to the church and the revolution. So the two-tiered class system has become three-tiered again, comprising the tiny upper class, middle class, or mostly the Inquilinos, and the lower class of kasamas or aparceros and jornaleros or day laborers. So upon the occurrence of the Inquilinos and their achievements, there were also issues that arise, outlining the boundaries of land, border conflicts, excessive collection of taxes, and land rent. So these are the reasons behind the rise of the Inquilinos.
Factors affecting the rise of the Inquilino. First, the demand for cultivation. The rise of the Inquilino started when the country required intensive cultivation of land for mass production after the end of the galleon trade and the opening of the Suez Canal. Second, acquiring wealth through profit gained from owned or rented lands. With the expansion of land, the portion of farmland leased to inquilinos also increased, which allows some of them to sublease their portion of lands to sharecroppers or the kasamas. This became very profitable that some of the inquilinos acquired a land of their own and enter into a gainful commercial ventures. Third, the role of Filipino women. In 1891, 30% of NAEC Cavites registered Inquilinos were women. Women's industry, frugality, and enterprising spirit have led to the improvement of their economic situations. The rise of the Inquilino has been deeply influenced by their independent nature and desire to succeed for their families. Thank you.